Hi, my name is Robert Briscoe, and this is my presentation on mergers and acquisitions. So, a merger is basically just when two or more firms choose to combine together under one ownership. An acquisition is just going to be when one company buys out the stock of another company, thereby they assume the ownership. And there's also consolidations, which is when two or more firms choose to dissolve into a completely separate identity. So that implies that they did it willingly, whereas the other two could be both hostile or friendly, depending on the situation. So basically, the types of M&As you have: horizontal, which is two competitors merging; vertical, which is going to be two firms that operate in the same industry, but at different levels merging. That's going to be like a tire company being acquired by an automobile factory. And then conglomerates are going to be firms that operate in completely different industries. They could be either pure or mixed, but that's the gist. Congeneric is going to be intended to increase their customer market. Basically, it's they have some similarities, but not a lot. And then strategic is just going to be like cross-border. They are the same products, but not actually competitors because they compete in like different countries essentially. So brief history: basically the early waves were characterized by horizontal mergers, and then in the 60s we saw conglomerate mergers show up. In the 80s we saw mega mergers, and it also introduced the idea of hostile takeovers. Then in the late 1990s we had the globalization movement, which brought many international mergers, and this was actually stopped by the 9/11 attacks. And then the kind of final wave we had is PE firms buying out, looking to make profits, and this was stopped by the 2008 financial crisis. So the growth of mergers and acquisitions is basically driven by economic booms, essentially. But if you look at it over the last century, it really has been growing. And in the last year, we had something like 51,000 different mergers and acquisitions that totaled $3.5 trillion. So it has been growing. This year's going to be down, but that's just estimations. So pros and cons: basically, the advantages is that it can create synergy between the companies, which will cause their costs to be reduced and productivity to increase. It also is a much faster way to grow than internally trying to grow. It also reduces your risk because the company's different days will offset each other. Some basic disadvantages: they can create monopolies, which is very bad for the market. You also have, there's going to be a great deal of tension between the target company and the acquisition company, typically because there's going to be a lot of job loss, new management coming in, and then it can also increase the debt of both companies, which can create issues. So just some examples of mega mergers: you have AOL merged with Time Warner for $162 billion. This was an example of a vertical merger, but actually AOL bought them at a huge premium, and this did not end up well for them, as they basically split several years later. ExxonMobil was an $80 billion deal. It's still in the top 10 biggest deals. It created an entity that rivals several oil-producing countries. It's a horizontal merger, as they were competitors. Cross-border examples, these are Anheuser-Busch, which is when they merged an American, Belgian, and Brazilian brewing company to create the largest in the world. BP and Amoco was going to take advantage of the fact that BP is strong in terms of market outreach, and then you have Amoco, which is going to have really strong refining techniques, which is where BP was weak. So again, with mergers, you're trying to take advantage of where one company is strong and the other is weak. So failed mergers: these are things like New York Central and Pennsylvania Railroads. So they were trying to cut their costs to compete with the changing industry, but in the end they filed for bankruptcy just 2 years after the merger because they couldn't compete with the fact that the trucking industry was just a cheaper option for companies, and then they weren't allowed to raise prices because of various government regulations. And then probably the worst merger that I found was Quaker Oats and Snapple. Quaker bought Snapple for $1.7 billion, which Wall Street thought was about $1 billion too much. And then they sold it just 27 months later for $300 million, which was a total loss of $1.6 million per day. They really just didn't understand the business that they were getting into, and that's going to be a huge problem. You always need to understand, what does this company do? If you're going to try and merge with them, you really need to understand their competitors and what drives their profits and stuff like that. That's the end. Thanks.